Hello everybody, welcome back to the Pinken.com Norwich City Podcast, the audio show that hopes to be a lot more like Teemu Pukki's volley at Newcastle rather than his miss at Tottenham, but we'll let you be the judge of that. Two games to kind of discuss this week with you. I'm your this week's host, Connor Southwell, standing in for David Freezer while he enjoys a bit of a break, and we're joined by my colleagues Paddy Davitt and Adam Harvey to review the last two Norwich City games. Of course, a 1-1 draw in the Northeast against Newcastle United and a 3-0 defeat against Tottenham on Sunday. We're actually going to start with the latter of those two games. We're going to start with the Tottenham game and work backwards, which maybe isn't a normal way to do it, but it's all about doing things differently, is it? As we'll come back on to later in the pod. Pads, when we talk about this Tottenham game, people are going to look at the scoreline, and Dean Smith said after the game he hoped that he wasn't subjected to lazy punditry, so I hope he doesn't listen to the podcast. But it is a 3-0 loss, and people will view that in a certain way. But is there an element of outcome bias about this result? The fact that maybe it's a 3-0 defeat, but for a large portion of that game, probably namely between the first and the 67th minute, Norwich were well in this contest.
They certainly were, until, quote, Dean Smith, quote, very annoyed at the manner of that second goal, which, anybody who watched it, either live or subsequently, was a pretty shoddy one from a defensive point of view. A corner they allowed a near post run unmarked, and then even the touch from Sanchez, bit fortunate, but still. But yeah, no, just before I get into that, I mean, his quote that you repeated there, Connor, about lazy punditry, that was in response to one of my questions. So I was a bit concerned when I saw him making the link between me and lazy punditry. I don't know where he's got that idea. He's only been in the build. Give him at least 2 months before he arrives at that conclusion. But yeah, he's right. My own sort of watching that unfold, as we all three of us did at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, was more positives than negatives, but ultimately the final whistle blows and it's a 3-0 defeat, and that feels like they've been well beaten and well off the pace, and in some facets, of course, namely goal scoring, they were, but you look at the possession stats, and as much as you want to place any store by that, but Norwich did have a fair modicum of control in terms of how the game ebbed and flowed, and partly that might have been Tottenham's set up under Conte, was clearly to sit back and almost wait for Norwich just to sort of get bored going laterally too often. But and then you attack with Heung-min Son and Lucas Moura, notably, and then obviously Harry Kane. As Dean Smith said, that was a lot of the reasoning why he tweaked the system and went 3 defenders essentially and 2 wing backs, was because he didn't want to, quote, go gung-ho and expose yourself to those 3 in particular, who are in Premier League terms as good as possibly everybody bar the Liverpool sort of battery of ammunition that they can put on the pitch. But yeah, I guess it's how positive you want to be, how full is your glass, because a 3-0 defeat, you've looked poor again in terms of attacking when you did create some very good chances, and you've also looked poor in some of the key defensive moments. That feels like a bit of a throwback to the pre-Smith era this season under Farke, and of course that trend continues. It won't be anywhere near good enough, and a defeat of that manner does nothing for the alarming goal difference as well. So all of those are true. All of those will have to be digested and worked on, particularly. But let's not lose sight of there was some positive elements in that performance, but also if you spread it over the 4 games we've had under Smith and Shakespeare, that I think there's more positives and there's more reasons to be encouraged than maybe fearing this is a continuation of a fairly regressive trend under Daniel this season. And final thing I'd say for now is, as Dean Smith said, he feels that they should have had more points on the board in those 4 games, and you wouldn't tend to disagree. Now, they haven't because of their own deficiencies as much as the quality they encountered against Tottenham. But I think there is a platform there, and something you can see he's trying to build that maybe not against the Tottenhams of this world who have that killer quality in the final third, but certainly against some of the lesser lights, might over the entire remainder of this season be enough to bring them certainly into a competitive space to try and stay up. But yeah, I guess ultimately a 3-0 defeat does feel, if you didn't digest the game as we did, a little bit like more of the same, and more of the same, as we know, isn't going to be good enough for Norwich this season.
It is interesting when we assess this game, Adam, because ultimately we're left with a conflict between maybe what the result tells us and perhaps what the performance told us for large portions of that game. And ultimately, there will be Norwich City fans who will put their fingers in their ears and say, well, performances don't mean anything, really. It's about points, particularly at this stage of the season where Norwich City currently find themselves in. But given what Paddy said there about the change that we've had in the dugout and maybe the improvements that Dean Smith laid out, it is important because these are elements that they can control within their performances. And as a general rule of football, if you can improve your performances and get them to a relatively consistent level, then as a result, the results tend to follow. So do you feel a little bit split by how to assess this game against Tottenham?
Yeah, obviously those first 11 games under Daniel Farke, I think most fans would say the performances weren't there, and you probably didn't see Norwich City even picking up a point in most of those games. They were comfortably beaten many times. And you can say under Dean Smith that those performances have generally improved, and the points have also improved as well. I mean, 5 points from 12 is still not a bad, take from those games. I think obviously, as Paddy alluded to, we probably should have had more, and Dean Smith's also said that. But yeah, as a rule of thumb, I mean, going to Tottenham away, you're probably not expecting to come away from there with anything, let alone 3 points. So I think to go from that, in terms of the performance we got there, and then I think you then go forward into these games sort of coming up with sort of more positivity based on the fact that if we'd have had sort of that clinical edge up top yesterday, I think that game could have been very, very different. I mean, you look at that Pukki chance early on. If you'd have buried that in the back of the net, you go 1-0 up, and those Tottenham fans might have slowly started to sort of turn, or the atmosphere wouldn't have been so loud as it was in that sort of end stand behind the goal at that point. So I do think the performances are quite crucial under Dean Smith. We have seen a general improvement. Obviously, Newcastle, which we're going to speak about in a moment, that wasn't such a great performance. But again, there was the issue of 10 men in that game, and a change of formation and tactics and everything that would have had to have come with that. So as a rule of thumb, I do think that the performances are improving, and we will see generally that the points will also improve with that as well.
Yeah, we'll come back to the missed opportunities. I can see Paddy's practically jumping out of his chair to discuss some of them. So we'll get back to them in a second. But just on this theme of kind of performances and results and where Norwich City are on that kind of spectrum, it is interesting, I think, that we have seen an improvement in terms of, and again, Dean Smith called himself a bit of a data geek when he arrives at Norwich. The performance data is heading in the right direction. That's not to over-egg this performance and say that Norwich City deserved anything out of the game, because they didn't. But I think it's probably a fair assessment to also say 3-0 probably isn't a reflection on how the game went. It probably wasn't as dominant as that looked. So that sort of lends the question, Pads, how do Norwich City marry those two things up? How do they get the performances in a place where the levels continue? Dean Smith sees what he wants to see in terms of intensity, in terms of a game plan. We saw Norwich tweak it yesterday, and getting the results to align with those as well. Is it just a matter of time before those two things align? Does it come back to that point, what we kind of speaking about quality in both boxes, which is an issue that Norwich City have had all season? It was something that Daniel Farke mapped out. How do you kind of see Dean Smith's next challenge of getting the performances or improved performances to result to improved results? Because arguably the game that they won, which was against Southampton, was maybe their worst performance of any of the Dean Smith games so far.
Over the entirety, yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, they were a little bit they were a lot laboured at Newcastle against 10 men for 80 minutes, but that's I don't think there's a very simple answer to that. It's personnel, it's personnel needing to step up now. Lise Malou, I'll pick him out. I don't think he's anywhere near the levels required. I'm not sure what he is in terms of what top midfielder. What he certainly isn't at the minute, anyway. And I don't wish to single him out particularly, but he's not somebody who looks like he can influence Premier League games in quite certainly the way Matthias Norman had started to do, or Mia Rashica. So it's personnel. It's trying to improve those. It's, to quote Dean Smith, it's coming to the party. If you're one of those attacking players who isn't going by the name of Teemu Pukki, you need to start scoring some goals. Defensively, as I say, yesterday, okay, the corner's a poor one because it's a set piece, and clearly him and Shakespeare have placed a lot of store both about attacking set pieces as an opportunity. Go back to the Southampton game. Grant Hanley scores the winner from a Billy Gilmore deep corner. But also defensively as well. It's such a cheap goal to give away. But overall, defensively, yeah, I mean, Gibson can do better for the third goal for me when Son sort of veers across the box, and in the final act before he shoots, he just sort of shrugs off Gibson. I think he needs to be a lot stronger in his one-on-one defending. But overall, I didn't think. Yes, of course, they've conceded 3 goals, and then even the first goal. I mean, it's a tremendous strike, but he's how many players has he popped the ball around? If you Lucas Moura there, so of course you can deconstruct any goal that you concede and look at it from a defensive point of view, what you didn't do. But despite conceding 3 goals, it might seem strange to say, I don't think as a collective defensive unit it was that lacking, really. It's certainly not that far removed from what we'd seen previously under the 3 previous Smith games. So in that regard, I think it's tweaking 1 or 2 things rather than, right, okay, we need to start again and Kabak needs to come in and Obama Daly needs to start. I don't think we need to get carried away with that marked a new nadir into. I mean, it was, you contrast yesterday with one of, was it their last trip to, no, tell a lie, the one before Brentford, which was Chelsea, where they were a complete shambles individually and collectively, defensively, without the ball that day. So, by no manner of means are we in that territory. And defensively, yeah, I think for me the focus is maybe some of those midfield places. I don't feel he's quite getting what he needs collectively and individually with and without the ball. And we said that really from day one, the start of the season. It didn't feel quite right, the balance. And of course, magnified by a player in the opposition ranks on Sunday, and Ollie Skip, who I think if he'd have dropped him into that midfield mix, certainly in those opening month, which were very, very difficult fixtures, I don't think Norwich would have been quite so easy to play against and around, and probably not conceded in quite the quantities they did. But that's wishful thinking. He's not part of the mix. So Matthias Norman looked to be capable of offering some of those attributes. And unfortunately, just through injury, with this ongoing pelvic issue, he's not available at the minute. And Rashica in the last 2 games, that's a big blow as well, because he was really rounding into some form that suggested that goal and that assist wasn't too far away. So clearly, that is out of Dean Smith's control, but he certainly needs those 2 back sooner rather than later. And then I just think it's kind of re-emphasising the fundamentals him and Shakespeare have tried to put in place in terms of the shape and the work and the set-piece work as well, the organisation. And then finally, it probably is personnel. It's Elise Malou, you get an opportunity, grasp it. Don't let the game pass you by, as I felt it did again yesterday. Ditto Dowell, when he's had opportunities, I don't think he's grasped it. And Adam Eder, I thought generally his all-round play was decent, but he's been paired alongside Pukki yesterday to offer a goal threat, and he's had an absolutely nailed-on opportunity to get off the mark. 6 yards out, no one near him, and he side foots it wide, and Sargent, of course, as well later on. So, ultimately, all Dean Smith can do is work with the resource he's got available. The solution has to lie within between now and January, and even when January comes around and the window opens, I don't think they've got the finance to suddenly go again on the scale they did in the summer. So it's really for Dean Smith and Shakespeare to extract more from this group of players. Now, that is partly down to the coaching and the messaging and what they do day to day at Colney. But for me, it's now increasingly more, it's on the players. If you're Lise Malou, if you're Sargent, if you're Eder, even Jolis at Newcastle, they haven't grasped their opportunities, for me, to really put an imprint on a Premier League game for Norwich and say, right, I'm in now and I'm not getting out again. And you're going to have to keep playing me. And you will do that through the quality of my performance levels. Now, ultimately, if we're still talking along these lines in a month and 2 months' time, that good signs but too many bad signs, then we may have to, sadly, arrive at the conclusion they're simply not good enough, or there's too many who aren't Premier League grade. And, of course, that was the charge, rightly, you could have labelled it the Daniel Farke Premier League team of 2 seasons ago, that they, in the final analysis, whatever else did or didn't happen, the raw material wasn't good enough. And everything we were told about the summer transfer window particularly, and also the lads who come back to the Premier League having been here 2 years ago, that they were 2 years further on in their development and their experience. They knew maybe a little bit more about what the Premier League was all about. Then we might have to reassess some of those sort of things that were put to us before a ball was kicked this season, because, if we're getting into sort of January, February, and we're still talking about, well, Lise Malou hasn't really convinced, or Eder doesn't look like he's going to have enough goals in him, or Sargent, then right here, right now, for this season, you have to say the conclusion would be that it really boils down to the players aren't good enough. And we'll soon find out in the weeks ahead, I think.
I guess it's difficult because if we're talking about a 3-0 defeat, and we were talking about it a few weeks ago under Daniel Farke, and it was, well, they lost 3-0, but at least it wasn't 7. And now we're talking about a 3-0 defeat, and it's and we're saying, well, it was 3-0, but maybe 2-0 or 1-0 would have been a fairer reflection on how the game actually went. Ultimately, they've still lost 3-0. So, as you say, and as you rightly say, Pad, in the final analysis, they've lost the game and they've lost it poorly. So, irrespective of what their performance is like, ultimately results, I suppose, will dictate how we feel about those performances, I suppose. Adam, just before we get onto the chances, which I promise we'll get onto in just a second, Dean Smith tweaked his formation for this one. It was the first time that we've seen him sort of veer away from the 4-3-3 that he played in his opening 3 games. This was more a 3-5-2 or a 5-3-2, however you want to look at it. Entirely up to you. But the wing backs did push on, so I'd be inclined to say it was more of a 3-5-2. Dean Smith explained that he felt that was because Norwich needed to have more men in central areas because of the quality that Son Heung-min, Harry Kane and Lucas Moura have, although 2 of those still got on the score sheet. But as we said, for large periods defensively, they did that well. He wanted to cause them a problem at the other end with Adam Ida and Teemu Pukki. The last time, as Paddy mentioned, that Norwich played this system, it was at Chelsea. They lost 7-0. It's fair to say that from that perspective, it looked a bit more solid. But do you see that formation being a viable sort of blueprint going forward for Norwich City now? We've got Manchester United at the weekend. Do you see that as another opportunity for Dean Smith to give this 3-5-2 a go?
Obviously, it seemed to work generally okay yesterday. I think if Norwich buried one of the chances they had, then I think people would have said that sort of did work in general. Obviously, defensively, as you've said, they were much more resolute, other than obviously the fact they did concede 3, but those chances probably should have been closed down, particularly the first one, a lot quicker. Obviously, Man U yesterday went in with a 4-2-2-2 under Ralph Rangnick for the first game. So obviously depends on what formation he's going to play midweek in the Champions League as to whether that is something he's going to bring to Carrow Road on Saturday, and the personnel that obviously he's got, whether he's going to, tweak that at all going into that game next Saturday. I think that'll obviously, Dean Smith will do some work in the week and try and work out, what sort of formation he's going to bring as to what's going to work best. Because obviously we have seen under him that he is willing to change personnel and formation. Obviously Farke in previous regimes hasn't really done that. He's obviously in the Championship typically stick with a 4-2-3-1. And in the Premier League this season, obviously started off with a 4-3-3, but obviously opted for 5 at the back when things were going wrong at the start of the year to try and, stop conceding so many goals. But we have seen Dean Smith sort of tweak formations so far this season, and I wouldn't be necessarily saying that he would do that on Saturday if he felt that, it worked well enough yesterday. But I do think a lot will depend on what Man U potentially put out during the week and what he thinks is going to work best.
Yeah, it's interesting the point you mentioned about Manchester United, and we might come back to that later on, actually, if we've got enough time towards the end. That probably lends us nicely, Pat. We've done 18 minutes so far without talking about, you both touched upon them, but the 3 major opportunities, obviously Teemu Pukki's after 3 minutes, where it's some good work from Lys Malou and Ida down the right. Ida's cross picks Pukki out. It's almost made for him, isn't it? He's not probably about 8-9 yards out from goal, and he just sweeps it straight into the hands of Lloris. We know what happens a few minutes later with Tottenham opening the score. Adam Ida has one later on where, again, Pukki completely slices his shot from a Brandon Williams cross. It falls to Adam Ida. He can't be more than 6 yards out, and he side foots it wide. My only maybe defence is that the ball came to him quickly. It was quite an instinctive way that he just flung his leg out. It was almost in hope rather than an expectation that he would get to it. He doesn't connect with it cleanly. And then, of course, the Josh Sargent one late on. And for all the talk about coaching and what Dean Smith can maybe do on the training pitch, there's not much you can do if your 3 strikers who you want those chances to fall to are missing them. And it's fair to say, Pad, the concern isn't that this is one-off in isolation. You look at the chances that Norwich City have missed this season. Josh Sargent against Brighton, that would have almost certainly guaranteed 3 points. You've got the ones that were missed against Wolves. Lucas Rupp missed a big one. Teemu Pukki as well. Max Aarons missed one. You look at the midweek in Newcastle. Lys Malou has a glorious chance in the final minute to win it. And these small moments, slowly but surely over the course of the opening 15 games of the season, have chipped away at Norwich City's points total. And that is going to be the frustration for Norwich City fans.
Yeah, I mean, when you were recounting the 3 Tottenham chances there, in terms of the proximity of where we were sat in the press area to Dean Smith, was not a huge amount away and kind of looking down on him, but not from a great height. And on all 3 of those opportunities, hands thrust ahead as if, what have I seen here? How have we not scored a goal on 3 separate occasions? And that just underlines how much frustration he will have felt on the touchline, because he will have known, the Pukki chance, 0-0 early in the game. Norwich have started very well, almost as if maybe that shape and the positional tweak had caught Tottenham and Conte out a little bit. And Norwich go 1-0 up in an environment where, I think it was 57,000 attendance, subtract the 3,000 or so from Norwich, 54,000 of those fans would have probably not wasted a huge amount of time getting onto the home players if they'd fallen 1-0 behind to a team who at kick-off were propping up the division, and deservedly so on the balance of the early evidence. So it boils down to, and then you subsequently picked out, all those other elements, Sargent against Brighton and Lys Malou against Newcastle. These are big moments in big games for Norwich, and they haven't been able to take those big moments. And I'm not going to repeat what I said in my previous answer, but ultimately, if that trend continues for the next month, 6 weeks, 2 months, then you have to question whether the players really are good enough, and then that will then obviously open a bit of a Pandora's box about the recruitment in the summer just gone, and or the faith shown in the guys who come back via the Championship promotion route, and all those questions will have to be answered because the evidence will be fairly compelling, and that ultimately what you've mapped out there, Connor, it's pertinent because this time 2 seasons ago, was it December where they played Wolves and played Tottenham, and there was 1 or 2 others. Palace springs to mind.
Sheffield United.
And almost the common theme was Norwich deserved far more than they got and created really good chances and didn't take them in a series of games. And then you look back and how that rest of that season petered out really in quite miserable fashion, how different it would have been if they'd maybe got the points all their football, the quality of their play and the chances they created had merited through that December period. And I really hope we're not sat here January the 1st sort of looking back and sort of saying, yeah, well, those parallels are obvious and we can't really ignore them because, at some point, if you're going to do what Norwich want to try and do, stay in the division, then you cannot simply, if you go through with a keeper to beat, as Lys Malou did at Newcastle in the 90, whatever it was, minute, and such a lack of conviction about his effort. Same with Sargent against Brighton, same with the 3 opportunities they had against Tottenham. There's a real lack of belief and almost I'm surprised the ball's coming to me in this golden shooting opportunity and I can't sort my feet out quick enough. It's, it's a really difficult one if you're Dean Smith because what you can't really get into the players too much because ultimately what he and Shakespeare are about now is building up their confidence and building up their belief. And I guess as much as they can't really financially look to do too much in January, what Smith does or doesn't see between now and January, I'm pretty sure will dictate in his own mind where he believes these group of players can take them. I mean, he's basically said he's still in this sort of phase of him and Shakespeare assessing what they've got in the squad. Well, I'd imagine if we roll on through the rest of this month and we're still sort of looking at a team who are struggling at the wrong end of the table and struggling to score goals and struggling to keep them out, then I think he'll have already made his mind up. And then, of course, it's a very difficult scenario for Stuart Webber because if Dean Smith and Shakespeare go to him and say, listen, we've looked at this group of players, we don't think there's enough here to keep them up, we're going to need to do something in January, then given the financial restrictions, given how difficult a market is generally, that's going to be an extremely tough ask. So, we can't overemphasize how crucial now these next few games are for so many reasons, for individual players, for Dean Smith and Shakespeare to maybe make definitive assessments, and also fundamentally whether Stuart Webber's going to be able to put his feet up for most of January or whether he's going to be burning the midnight oil and his phone bill is going to go through the roof. So it's all to play for, really, starting with, what on a paper looks a very, very exciting Carrow Road affair against Manchester United, but without getting into too much depth about what's beyond the horizon, but West Ham, Arsenal, Villa, and all the Dean Smith, Emi Buendia subplot to that. It's not the easiest of runs on paper, so but that's what it is, and that's the Premier League, and Norwich just have to crack on with it. But it's worryingly hard to shed the feeling that they've probably left 4 points out there against Wolves and Newcastle, and what could that mean in terms of the bigger picture? Because if you add 4 points to what they were already on the board, if not out of the bottom 3, they'd be pretty close. In fact, I think they probably would have been.
They'd be out. Yeah,
they would. And then the Tottenham game you could package in within, but it's Tottenham, and that's not who we're competing against. We're competing against Newcastle and those type of teams, and we've picked up points under Smith already. So yeah, but we can't look back now. Those games are gone. They didn't get the extra 4 points, so it's all about looking forward now. But I just think if you're Smith and Shakespeare and you see a few more of these type of performances where a lot of good things, but in the key moments, in the key parts of games, not enough quality, not enough belief or conviction, then you'll probably swiftly arrive at the conclusion we need a bit of help, Stuart.
Yeah, we're told regularly in terms of people who do football analysis, it's not necessarily about players missing opportunities. It's about being in the positions to miss the opportunities. And it's worth noting that Norwich's expected goals, if that's a figure that you align with, and a lot of people don't, but the facts are that in 3 of Smith's 4 games, Norwich have registered an XG of over 1, which is significantly higher than they were measuring on average under Daniel Farke. That does show an improvement in terms of the creation of chances. And I do have a slight issue to an extent with people, and maybe this isn't the tone, maybe I'm reading it wrong, but it feels like a lot of it is, don't worry, in January, Norwich will get a striker and it will be fine. Well, it's a more difficult market for one. They tried to do the same in the summer and ultimately ended up with Josh Sargent, who at the moment is a player who doesn't really look of the standard of what they need. They spent nearly £9 million on him. So I'm not necessarily sure that the answer is within the January transfer window. And if it is, it's probably worth 20 or 30 million pounds. And that's just simply not doable on any kind of level for Norwich City. And equally, any striker that they do get at the moment, if we're talking about being in the financial constraints of what they have available, is probably going to be closer to Josh Sargent than it is Teemu Pukki. So that's very difficult. And if you're a striker looking at it, you will look at Norwich City and go, oh, well, Teemu Pukki's played a lot of minutes, so I'm not going to get many. It's very difficult to then attract a striker who's going to be of the standard, I think. So I'm not necessarily sure the answer exists within the January transfer window, unless they could do something clever around the loan, which maybe we'll come back to. But equally, there's 5 games until then, Adam. And as Paddy mapped out there, they're against very tough opposition. And there is the danger that very quickly Norwich City get cut adrift. That's a real possibility. The fixtures they have at this month are very hard. Look, they could win a couple and we could all be looking upwards rather than, well, you can't look over their shoulders because they're bottom of the division. But you know what I mean? Rather than looking in and around them, I suppose. So there is an element actually that this is an issue that Norwich City kind of need to resolve now rather than in a month's time where I suppose in many ways it could be a little bit too late for them.
I think that's the problem, irrespective of whether we get to January and they want to try and bring in a striker. If Norwich have registered 0 points or even just 3 points and they're cut adrift at the bottom, then who's going to want to come into the club? And there's nothing really to play for at that point because they could potentially be in an area where they almost, not necessarily relegated, but they're kind of looking to the point where they are so far cut adrift that it's going to be a huge, huge task, even bigger than it is when Dean Smith came in. And obviously, we kind of spoke about it yesterday, going back. It probably would have to be a loan signing. And if you're going to try and do that, then you probably need to try and get rid of one. And that would probably have to be Kabak if he's not going to get minutes under Dean Smith, which at the moment, it doesn't look like he's going to get any. But then again, who's that going to be? What sort of striker would Dean Smith want to bring in who's going to come in and score goals? Because I think Ida looks quite raw still, probably needs minutes and more game time. Maybe a championship loan would be something that would be more feasible for him. And Sargent, we've seen more as a wide man as opposed to a striker under Dean Smith and even under Farke towards the end. So other than Pukki, who potentially, if an injury came in as well before Christmas, then that could really be a huge blow for Norwich if they are going to try and register some points between now and that January transfer window anyway.
Is that where we are then, Pad, with it? Is this now about not necessarily what Norwich City are doing as a team and the construction of chances anymore? Is it about the quality they have when they get in those positions? And given what we've said here about January and how difficult a market that is, everyone seems to be looking for a striker in January. That tends to be the saying, doesn't it? Stuart Webber has already predicted a very quiet window, not just for Norwich City, but in general, beyond probably Newcastle United. We know he doesn't like particularly operating in the winter markets. He sees that as a moment or a window, really a month of panic and confusion, I suppose. So how do Norwich City go about improving their goals return? Because the simple truth at the moment is that unless Teemu Pukki scores a goal for Norwich City very rarely score. So if we're saying that the chances are being created, they're not being converted, and maybe the resource isn't going to be there in January to certainly buy a striker who's maybe of the standard that they need, where ultimately do we end up?
If I knew the answer to that, Connor, I would be selling that to the highest bidder, let me tell you. Because if you're saying we can't buy anybody and they don't look like they've got enough quality
well, isn't it more about that if Norwich buy someone, as they did with Josh Sargent in the summer, they're essentially going to buy a player who isn't rough or ready essentially for this level? There's going to be an element of risk. There's going to be probably a youth about them, maybe a ceiling that they need to fulfill that maybe they're not currently at right now. Isn't that more the point rather than sort of the one you're making, I suppose?
Well, I mean, ultimately, that just comes down to, and yes, January is a tougher window to do this than the summer because it's much more concertinaed and much more desperation, whether you're at the top or trying to get to the top, or you, as Norwich look like they're going to be at the bottom, trying to stay out of the bottom. So, but ultimately, it comes down to how astute is your recruitment, how good is your scouting, how good is your analysis. Then, do you have somebody in a position like a Stuart Webber who can go and find a gem or two? I mean, I know he didn't come in the January, but Emi Buendia was a deal that they constructed and got over the line in a January, and I think he again came in a few months later. But there's other examples of deals they've constructed in January, so it is doable. I don't think it's literally a case of Stuart Webber doesn't like working in January, so forget it. Because ultimately, what's changed this January, as opposed to all the other Januaries when he was in charge at Norwich, is the head coach has changed, and pretty recently, certainly in terms of the proximity to the window. And ultimately, Dean Smith, I'm sure, will want to start to put his stamp on it in terms of bringing in one or two of his own players, while still clearly, as he must do, work with essentially Daniel Farke's squad. But that goes back to what we said earlier. If he gets to the end of December and he really has seen a body of games and a body of training as well, because as he said when he first came through the door, he's watching everything, everything about the behaviours and how they are around the training ground, how they interact with people. All of that information is getting processed by him and Shakespeare, and they will arrive pretty soon, I think, at a definitive conclusion on a lot of players in that current squad. And if the balance tips too far towards we need some help, then Stuart Webber needs to find him some help. Now, how he does that is obviously the great imponderable. But, you touched on it a little bit earlier. We could probably get into that now. If Kabak doesn't kick a ball between now and January, then I think it's in all the interested parties to shake hands and back you go to Schalke, mate. And that would feasibly free up a potential overseas loan route. So you're not, committing to a huge 6, 7, 8, 9+ million pound outlay, because I don't think they've got the money, certainly in the current climate, to do that without maybe selling one of their younger players potentially, which I'm sure is a route they wouldn't want to go down, because ultimately they need every bit of quality they can get their hands on to try and stay up. So we don't know, but are the wheels already starting to move in that direction? That is a creative way potentially, and of course you've then still got to find somebody in a foreign market. There's a lad who's scoring a lot of goals in is it Croatia at the minute? I forget his name, but they could maybe go and get him. I think he knows a little bit about Norwich as well. So, but flippancy aside, is there a player doing something similar in one of these European leagues that they could maybe loan with a view to and entice the player and club to part with said player in January? But you are right. I mean, whoever, if they do bring anybody in, whoever they bring in, there's going to be an element of gamble, as there was, sadly, and it failed, Andre Duda when he came in the January of the Premier League season under Farke with his huge reputation. I mean, I remember Daniel saying this, if we'd wanted to buy this guy in the previous summer, £25 million after he'd had an unbelievable season in the Bundesliga, an attacking midfielder with goals, quality, ability to assist. We saw none of that whatsoever. So that, unfortunately, is the huge roll of the dice. If they decide, or if Dean Smith decides, I need help here, Stuart, then I'd imagine Webber will try and deliver, and his track record tells you he probably will be able to deliver by hook or by crook. But whoever he delivers, there's still a huge element of gamble, because, if they've not had any Premier League exposure or any exposure to the English game, then all of that is up in the air. And it's not like you can let them bed in for 6 months, because by then the season will be well over and Norwich's fate will have been sealed one way or the other. So, look, there's no easy answers, is there? If the current Smith and Shakespeare cannot get a tune, as he said yesterday, if certain players cannot come to the party, and it isn't just Eder or Sargent. It's Rashica when he's fit and firing. It's all right showing us potentially what he can offer. We need to see it. We need to see goals. We need to see assists. Zolis, if he gets an opportunity. Cantwell, if he comes back into the fold and gets a run of games. There's a player who has a track record, albeit a smallish sample, but still a track record of goals and assists in the Premier League. We need to see something from him. Dowell finally needs to grasp the nettle, This is where we're at. This is where Dean Smith is at. It's about this group of players and, can he extract it, but can those players step up to the mark? And, we will find out pretty soon, I think, whether either he can get a tune out of them or whether they're good enough to get a tune out of. And if they're not, then, it's going to be a very difficult few months ahead, I think. But as I say, I mean, we're talking here off the back of a 3-0, which has maybe exposed some of the flaws and the structural imbalances in the squad that we'd seen too often under Farker. But prior to Sunday, 3 very, very encouraging performances, 2 at Carrow Road, where, with the crowd behind them, they really had Southampton and Wolves to a degree on the ropes. And I think any team coming to Carrow Road, as Dean Smith has already said, need to get back on the coach at the end. And that applies to Manchester United this weekend, knowing they've had a hell of a game. And I think whatever we can get into the whys and wherefores about the quality deficit or the chronic lack of goals or maybe the defensive issues still that persist, I think they've still got enough about them to give any team a tough game at Carrow Road. And then it's just, as we said a bit earlier on the pod, in the key moments, can they find the right answer? Can they score the goal, find the killer pass? Can they be resolute when they get put under pressure at the other end? And ultimately, when the dust settles and all the talking stops, if that isn't the case, then back to the Championship they will go.
Ultimately, Adam, we're left talking again about a recruitment decision and one potentially being made in January, and it's just about how they maybe shuffle their pack to do that. And I think you both make a good point about Kabak and maybe freeing up an overseas loan to potentially fill that hole. There's obviously been talk, which I'll ask Pat about in a minute, about Adam Eder maybe going out on loan and Jordan Hugill coming back. But there has been, after this defeat, and I would say it's probably been bubbling for a little while. Dean Smith mentioned about other players and other new signings needing to come to the party a little bit. There's been some question marks over the recruitment work that Norwich City did do in the summer, and particularly a lot of that has arrived at Stuart Webber's door in his direction. He obviously, it kind of felt that before Daniel Farker was sacked, it was either you took the view that Norwich City as a Premier League squad were underperforming, and that was on the coach, or that their recruitment wasn't quite as good as perhaps we all thought it was. And Daniel Farker, as he said, the bus driver couldn't do any better than what I did in the first 10 games, whatever the quote was. So ultimately, it lays at Stuart Webber's door. Now, he sacked Daniel Farker, so clearly he feels that it is the former of those. He feels the squad is good enough. Dean Smith has subsequently come in and is much more aligned to that view, I would say. So, with the spotlight being placed on recruitment, do you think that's particularly fair, given the outlay that they spent in this summer, given what we've spoken about different players being at different stages? What have you made of perhaps some of the question marks being asked about Norwich City's work in the summer?
I remember Stuart Webber's interview before the Leeds game, and he referenced that a lot of these players obviously have never played at Premier League level. A lot of them are quite young players that will need time to develop, especially playing at the top level in arguably the best league in the world. But at the end of the day, Norwich City have spent £70 million. There's going to be a bit more expectation this season, and naturally that's what there has been. And ultimately, under Daniel Farker, they didn't really live up to that. And we are starting to see signs of that under Dean Smith, that there is players amongst this group. Obviously, Rashica, I think, that injury is a huge blow, because he really was starting to show that he has that capability to play at this level. And we're starting to see a player that was being touted with some big clubs when he was at Bremen before, sort of that slight injury hit spell he had in the last season with them. Norman, obviously, I think is probably the one that stood out in that regime, in that summer transfer window that they've brought in. He really has sort of been the standout player for Norwich, and he's obviously sort of had that goal threat as well, which for a player that's obviously playing midfield has been a huge bonus. But yeah, on the whole, I'd say a lot of the players they brought in probably haven't lived up to that expectation. And we are starting to see that under Dean Smith, that there is definitely some players amongst that. But I think there's certain individuals that I'm not going to reference because it'll be a bit harsher on Josh Sargent, but he is starting to get a bit of stick as well, which, it is what it is. But Yeah, I do think that there's definitely some sort of room for manoeuvre as to what they bring in January. Is that going to get the same stick, if they don't get it right again under Stuart Webber in the Premier League?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of mitigation behind the summer deal. Someone like Christos Solis, for example, there's so much hype about 19 years of age, Greek international, new country, all of those elements, new league. There's plenty of stuff that you can maybe add to these players to caveat maybe why it's been perhaps a slower start than some were expecting. But as you rightly say, given the numbers involved, what is it, the 11th highest spenders in Europe, there is always going to be a degree of expectation that comes with that. So yeah, I think you make a valid point. Pad, just finally to close off this debate on January striking options, where Norwich City currently are, the lack of goals, the chronic lack of goals, I suppose. They've only scored 8 so far this season. There was a report that emerged on Sunday morning, I think it was from Alan Nixon in The Sun, about Adam Ida, which was perhaps made more interesting given that he started a Premier League match for only the second time a few hours later. But this essentially said that Norwich City were looking to get him out on loan. Nottingham Forest was listed as the club who was perhaps leading the queue, and that as part of that, Norwich City would look to make up the numbers essentially by recalling Jordan Hugill, who has received plenty of criticism for his own performances at West Brom. So first and foremost, what do you make of that report? Do you think it's viable? And second, Adam Ida and where he's currently at. I mean, we saw him again yesterday. I would agree with you. I felt particularly at Newcastle, it was a very good cameo. It was a step forward. There was plenty in open play that we saw. But there's still a rawness, isn't there, that underpins everything that he does at the moment. And he does just look like he needs to find a rhythm or get a consistent stream of game time. And it's difficult to see how that's going to happen at Norwich City because of Teemu Pukki, quite frankly.
That is the problem. Yeah, unless you change the lineup to accommodate both, as Dean Smith did yesterday. Going back to the reports, I mean, it was the same journalist, I believe, who had Ida swapping with Adam Armstrong when that was, gathering a lot of legs. Sadly, not in the direction of Norwich as he headed to Southampton. But I don't know whether he's got a hotline to the Ida camp. I'm purely speculating there. But the bottom line is Dean Smith clearly didn't read those reports because a matter of a few hours later, he's naming him on his team sheet for his first Premier League start of the season. So, and when asked, funny enough, separate to any of that speculation, but on Friday about Ida specifically, he basically said, I can see the potential. There's a talent there. But Teemu Pukki, and these were Dean Smith's words, is the benchmark right here, right now, in terms of leading the line for Norwich, both in terms of goals, which we've talked liberally at length about in this podcast, and but also his general all-round play. And I'd agree with you. I think that miss aside, I thought I liked some of the things I saw from him in general play. He has been a little bit too easy to get levered off the ball in the cameos that he has had thus far. But I felt the last 2 games, whether that's something somebody's pointed out to him or physically he's just worked at his ability to shield the ball. But, he had some really good tussles with Davinson Sanchez particularly and was able to hold the ball up, lay it off. There was a nice turn and pivot for Kenny McLean in the first half, and that sort of led to an opportunity which came to nothing. But real good hold-up play. And also, ultimately, if you actually click back in terms of the key moments in the game on Sunday, the Teemu Pukki chance in the 3rd minute came from an Adam Ida cross, having sort of shown down the right and linked with Lise Malou and then gone again. And really penetrative play. And it's just such a shame that he couldn't slot that in 6 yards out in the second half, because a bit like with Sargent and Brighton, what would that have done to the confidence of a young man there who would have had his first Premier League goal under his belt? And I think I'm right in saying first Premier League goal on. I don't recall him. Yeah. So, I think I would, in terms of Adam Ida and where he goes in January, I think I'd be inclined to take my lead from the fact that Dean Smith included him, that he's still very much open-minded about where Adam Ida is going to be playing his football from January onwards. Otherwise, I think maybe a little bit like Kabak, he'd be at best on the bench and maybe not even making the 18. But of course, that partly might be due to there isn't a huge amount of striking depth in the group at senior level, hence why, to flip it, maybe the talk of Hugill. But I think that's probably more from the West Brom angle. 1 goal in 16 loan appearances. He was on the bench again at Coventry on Saturday. That clearly isn't what he was hoping when he went to the Hawthorns on a season-long loan, nor is it what West Brom were hoping for. They're well off the pace in terms of the automatics. Also included in that report was that they are looking at bringing in some extra firepower themselves in January. If so, then that might signal that they probably made up their minds that Hugill isn't for them for whatever reason. And as a result, it might be with Hugill, I mean, speculating, it might be more a case of rather than Norwich want to bring him back, maybe it's West Brom sending him back. But, it would be another body. We discussed this on the drive back from Tottenham. It would be another body and a very popular figure in and around the group, an experienced head as well, albeit didn't have a huge amount of Premier League exposure with West Ham. You debate whether on the pitch could he add an extra dimension. It didn't really happen for him at Championship level, so it's hard to construct an argument that he could be the difference at Premier League level. But, in certain situations, to be throwing him on and offer a different threat, a bit more physical, a bit more direct, who knows, But he certainly is a very positive presence around the dressing room. So there's definitely plus points to bringing Hugill back for me in January, but I don't subscribe to the theory that would necessarily be one in and one out, because I think it's still, ultimately, if you've got the same number of strikers and you feel, heaven forbid, you're an injury away to Teemu Pukki from really exposing what you've got in the striking department, I don't think you'd roll the dice and let Ida go out, albeit on a personal level for the lad. We'll say he doesn't play too much more football between now and January. From a personal point of view, yes, that probably does make sense that he goes and has, 20-odd games for a Championship team, week in, week out, and really, get to grips. It was interesting, funny enough, just turning it around now before we got into the podcast, that Ollie Skip touched on him earlier. He was the cover interview in Tottenham's Matchday programme. I've read the interview, and he talked about when he went to Norwich, what his expectations were, and he hoped to play some regular football. He didn't think he would have played 45 out of 46 games for Norwich, but he basically talks in there about the huge difference between playing as opposed to training week in and week out, but not having the game at the weekend. And clearly, the proof's in the pudding. He went back to Tottenham, albeit it's a different manager there now, but he's gone back there and he's a starting option for Tottenham off the back of sustained loan football, when he's gone from potential to, no, actually, this guy could be ready right here, right now for our first team. Adam Ida needs to go through the same transformation. And if it's not to be at Carrow Road in a Norwich shirt, then it definitely needs to happen and happen pretty swiftly. Now, when I say swiftly, maybe not necessarily in January because of all the other issues around Dean Smith's sort of striking options. But certainly, if we get to the end of this season and we look back and Adam Ida has stayed here and had a handful of starts, then I think it's absolutely imperative he gets himself away somewhere on loan in the summer and goes and plays a regular full season of ideally maybe Championship football. Now, of course, I don't want to be a doommonger, but if Norwich find themselves back in the Championship, then maybe his opportunity will come in a Norwich shirt. But right here, right now, I was a bit surprised that we're already seeing speculation around Ida and his future, because I just don't see allowing Ida out and not bringing anybody in. Even if you brought Hugill back, that to me doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of Norwich protecting their position at the top end of the pitch. So time will tell. But I don't think it'll be the last story. Put it that way, we read about Adam Ida if he goes sort of back to the bench and back to 10 minutes here, 5 minutes there between now and January, because that's not really in his interests. It's not really in Norwich's interest, because they all feel, Dean Smith's the latest to publicly say it, there is a talent there, but turning that talent into an actual proven Premier League goal scorer, well, that is the challenge now for Dean Smith, Shakespeare, for Neil Adams and Stuart Webber, and all the coaches, really. How do you take him on that last step from, we think this guy's got all the raw material, but we now need to see him produce it? And obviously, really, that's what we're talking about broadly, isn't it, in terms of the whole Norwich squad? Can the ones who have question marks against them at Premier League level, can they really step up now over these next few weeks, particularly, and prove, yes, that person is a Premier League player, rather than probably a bridge too far?
He turns 21 in February, doesn't he? I can't help but think about someone like Max Aarons and how many minutes he had by the time he was 21. Adam Ida, nowhere near that, certainly in terms of club perspective, certainly nowhere near that for Norwich City. And there is a fear that for all this talk of potential, if very soon we don't see it realised, then ultimately all we're going to be left with is a player who isn't quite good enough, and that potential will have maybe burned away. And I don't think, given the journey he's been on since he arrived at Norwich in 2017, that anyone wants that to happen. So it's a little bit strange position that he finds himself in. Adam, I did want to reflect on Newcastle very, very quickly before we look ahead to Manchester United at the weekend. How did you kind of feel leaving St James's Park, because I saw a lot of, again, we spoke about maybe the Spurs scoreline not reflecting how the game had gone. There was a lot of confliction around this result as well, because there were some people who said, well, it's a point on the road in the Premier League. You can't kind of turn your nose up at that. It's maybe an improvement to where Norwich City were a few weeks ago. There were some people who, particularly given the context of Newcastle being down to 10 men essentially for 80 minutes, disappointed that Norwich City didn't win it. There was frustration maybe at the manner of their performance, and they maybe didn't look as effective as has been the case under Smith, particularly in his opening 2 games. Where did you kind of find yourself on that spectrum after the game? Somewhere between all three, because I can kind of put a foot in all camps and understand all of those perspectives.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a hard one to process, because coming out of, obviously got the late equaliser, which it was obviously being titled a relegation decider by a certain organisation. And I think the more importantly, Norwich didn't lose that game, because I think that, well, look at it now, Newcastle would have another 2 points on the ball and Norwich would be one further worse off. So at least now they're still in that pack of teams that are chasing Watford just above the relegation zone. But it is one of those that I think if Pukki goes through and buries that chance and Clark doesn't get, in and take him down for the red card, Norwich go 1-0 up. St James's Park, obviously notoriously, is a very sort of, if the fans get on top of you, and I think they would have turned quite quickly, even despite it being Eddie Howe's first game in the dugout, and you then go 1-0 up there, and then you got something to build on. And we've seen Norwich in the last 2 games previously before that, they had looked pretty good in general play. So I think they would have potentially gone and potentially built on that and maybe even come away with the 3 points. I do think the red card almost was probably not necessarily what Norwich wanted, because obviously they had to adapt and change completely from the game plan that Smith had originally laid out for the game. But I think, in the end, probably a point was a fair result, and Newcastle they'd probably felt disappointed they didn't come away with all 3, and a lot of their fans still felt fairly frustrated at the end of the game. So, a decent point in the end. Any point away from home in the Premier League is a good point. But I think the fact it was against 10 men for 80 minutes is probably where the disappointment is at for many Norwich fans, particularly when they played so well against Wolves in the previous game.
Yes, but it's probably one of those that you look back on in April and it'll either look like a really good point or it'll look like 2 points dropped. And at the moment, I think given, as we discussed, the chances that have been missed in some of these games, at the moment, they feel like points dropped rather than points gained. Maybe we'll view that slightly differently. And as Paddy said earlier on, in the next few weeks, when potentially the situation, we hope in a positive sense, could look a lot more different. Finally then, Pad, as we look to close off the pod, Manchester United this weekend, it doesn't really get any easier for Norwich City from a fixture list perspective, but you have to play every team twice in the Premier League, so that is part of it. Unfortunately, they haven't played Manchester United yet. Unfortunately for them, it comes at a point where they've got a new man in the dugout in Ralf Rangnick, who is essentially the godfather of German coaching. They tell him he's one of these coaches that have influenced a lot of the top coaches, Thomas Tuchel, Jurgen Klopp, Gegen-pressing kind of style, very influential in the rise of the Red Bull teams as well, particularly Leipzig in Germany. He is going to change Manchester United. It feels like, similarly to what we saw with Smith, there's going to be some kind of bounce. I think the next 10 games for United are relatively favourable. So it's probably fair to say that this prospect at this moment, and as Adam says, they have a Champions League game in midweek, is maybe slightly more difficult for Norwich City than it would have been if this game would have arrived 4 or 5 weeks ago when Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was in the dugout.
Yeah, it feels that way. Yeah, he's a bit of a soccer bot devotee, isn't he, as well? I'm pretty sure. You want to get him down to Colney, lock him in the soccer bot. And he won't be able to get to Carrow Road. I jest. I think, I mean, even if Solskjaer was still in play, they are, it's hard to fathom with the amount of individual quality they have at their disposal, why they continually seem to be in this almost, dare I say, we just discussed them, like that Newcastle-esque soap opera that seems to envelop that club. Obviously for United, only post-Ferguson, but just with all the cards that they can put on the table, why they still really quite a way away from the Liverpools and the Man Cities for me, and even Chelsea this season from being a serious Premier League title contender, and as a result, obviously Solskjaer's out and they brought in this guy, and there's no doubt that I'm sure he will have an impact, but ultimately I'm getting to the sort of stage now where it's almost to a degree irrelevant who is in the opposite corner for Norwich now. It's got to the point where it has to be about Norwich. It has to be about what Dean Smith and Shakespeare can do in terms of setups, in terms of getting the right selection calls, and then the risk of sort of labouring the point, the players that they trust to go out on the pitch, carry out the instructions, and actually, as Dean Smith keeps saying, you're not here by accident. You are Premier League players, but you need to go and show it now. You need to go and prove you do belong in this company. And they did maybe for 3 of the first 4 games. They did to a degree at Tottenham, but ultimately some of the old failings came back to haunt them a little bit. That needs to be swiftly eradicated, and they need to go again. And I just think it's not a cliche you really want to lapse into, but at Carrow Road, I think the Saturday night under lights, pre-festive, the expectation, the noise that could be generated there, I think that could drive that group of players on and hopefully to a positive result. Now, whether that's a win or not, time will tell. But certainly I look at that United group and I think, individually they can hurt you. There's no doubt about it. If they click, then, as we saw with Lucas Moura and Son on Sunday, individual quality sometimes at this level, you just have to hold your hands up and say, too good. And United have plenty of that in their armoury, but they're where they are for a reason. They've made a change in the head coach for a reason. There's something clearly not quite right within that group of players, within that dressing room. And I don't think a new coach, even if he is the guru of German coaching fraternity, is going to be able to eradicate all of those issues in the space of a week, 8 days, working with the players on the training pitch. As Adam rightly said, they've also got a Champions League game in between. So the focus can't be fully on Norwich and Carrow Road, albeit I think they've already qualified for the later stages. But that's, from Norwich's point of view, another game, another distraction. That's all welcome. But I just think whether it be, United at home, whether it was Wolves before, whether it's Southampton before that, it's about Norwich now. It's about Norwich as a collective, as individuals, driven on by Smith and Shakespeare, imposing themselves with the backing of a Carrow Road support behind them onto the opposition and just making life uncomfortable. And then we'll see what these teams are made of. If they have the quality to withstand that and, produce something out of nothing, a moment of magic, then you just hold your hands up and you say, that's the Premier League. That's what Norwich are up against, sadly. But what we don't want really is another nearly type of performance, or, well, if they could only, take their chances, if they could only defend set pieces better. I don't really want the narrative after this game, whatever the result, to be more of the same, well, there you go. It's, each passing week tells you it isn't maybe the head coach was the issue, it was the players. And that needs to change, and that needs to change pretty quickly because, yes, under Smith so far, they've reattached themselves to that clump of clubs at the bottom, but, fail to take a decent amount of points between now and Christmas, then they'll be cut adrift again. And then it's a long way back. It really isn't an over-exaggeration for me to state that, what happens in the second part of the season a long part of that could be decided by what happens in these next 4 or 5 games. And, United's the first one. It's at Carrow Road. So if Norwich take care of what they need to take care of, then what I do know is, on the evidence of the Southampton second half particularly, Wolves second half, but probably an hour against Wolves, that United will have to be a lot better than maybe they've shown in a lot of games to get the result. And that's all you can ask for. What you don't want is, and sadly we saw it too many times in the Daniel in the Premier League, teams turning up at Carrow Road, taking liberties, and Norwich rolling over and not really even putting up a fight. If I see a committed performance, energy, tempo, Kenny McLean looking like a man possessed, driving them on from the middle of the park, Pookie, no Rashica obviously this weekend, but players around him on the turn, attacking, putting defenders on the back foot. If we see all of those elements, and it isn't quite good enough because of the quality in the opposition ranks, then, I think I could accept that. Norwich fans would have to speak for themselves. But certainly what we don't want is, this is Manchester United. Look, there's Ronaldo, there's Paul Pogba. On you go and roll over and walk off the pitch getting beat by 2 or 3. I don't think anybody, fans, players, or Dean Smith, should be willing to accept that.
Very quickly then, Pad, how much would we have to pay for you to replicate Cristiano Ronaldo's famous celebration, do you think?
I'd probably do it for £1,000, Connor. If you want to crowdsource that, I'd probably do it. Forgive me, what is his famous celebration? You can see how much I watch United. It's not the one
the famous Sue on that one.
What, where he just jumps and turns in the air and then puts his hands
Yeah.
there? Oh yeah, I'd do that for £1,000. Yeah, no bother.
Adam, would you do it for cheaper than £1,000? That's probably the most pertinent question.
Oh, match pad, I'll go £1,000 as well.
£1,000. So there you go. If anyone out there wants to donate £2,000 to see Paddy and Adam copy,
Can I just make that clear?
celebration,
That's not well. Maybe as it's Christmas, I'll donate half of that to charity. But I've got a toddler who needs some Christmas presents, so that'd be welcome to the kitty. It's not going to happen, but you never know. You can live in hope.
There you go. Good stuff, gents. Thank you all very much for listening to this week's NorwichCityPinkin.com podcast. Dave teased it in the last podcast, but we have also launched our new app, Pinkin Plus. You can check out our website, pinkin.com, for all the details on that. If you subscribe right now, you get a 2-month free trial. So essentially, you won't be charged a penny until February. When you take that up, I think it's 60 days free. In fact, it'll be $1.99 thereafter. Plenty of exclusive content. There's going to be a little bit more of the podcast as well, which we're about to record. There's a certain Norwich City striker that we haven't really touched upon. We're going to discuss him in a bit more detail in that podcast. So subscribe to our app to listen to that. Plenty more good stuff over there as well. It's well worth checking out. Thank you very much for listening this week. Let's hope Carrow Road is a cauldron of noise for the visit of Manchester United on Saturday, and hopefully they'll end with 3 more points. Thanks for listening.